but the arguments that they're using, this is what you're going to see from every single right-wing movement in the future or center-right movement in the future that does not explicitly identify as nationalist or alt-right. The arguments that they're making about why capitalism just is, that's science, why we're not promoting racism or sexism, but we are very interested in some extremely antiquated ideas about scientific differences, quote unquote, right? So what you're seeing in these arguments, and I'm just going to bring in two other things because there's a lot to cover here and I can kind of get lost in the weeds. A basic difference, I would say, between left and right is the difference between historicizing and naturalizing. If you're on the left, broadly speaking, you look at things and you say, what are the historical, material reasons why that is happening? If you're on the right, you say that is what it is. Now, paradoxically, this is actually a reason why right now there's a lot of conflict between people who are more socialistic and people who are more like woke, quote unquote. Because their moral dimension is better. Look, America as a racist society is correct. Acknowledging that truth versus denying that truth is a major difference. No question. However, if you read Adolf Reed, who's one of my intellectual heroes, I really hope everybody is reading him, he will tell you why racism and white supremacy is a multi-generational project in America that depends on economic conditions, that manifests in different geographies, that is inseparable for how we produce and do capitalism. And actually, it might become separable, right? Whereas some people who have a woke discourse, it just is. It's the religious foundation of America. There's no difference between any different historical periods. It's just this moral block statement. Does that make sense? So some of these critiques can get really subtle, and that's actually what started to occur to me with the IDW and dealing with the right, because these guys were exploiting a lot of weaknesses. They were coming in and they were seeing people, you know, look, if your pop culture diet, and let's say you're an alienated young man, which is the primary audience for these guys. That's just market demographics. That's not a moral statement. I did some brand work. This is just like you're looking at your demos. You're alienated. You don't feel powerful. You probably have a lot of actually very valid complaints in your life. You flip open, say, some mediocre, bougie website that you think is the left, and what do you have? Seinfeld's actually problematic, and you suck, and shut the fuck up, and this is a problem, and that's a problem, and this is this, and that, da, da, da. And then Jordan Peterson comes along and goes, no, actually, you're great, and you should have a government-provided wife to massage you.
This is the very first episode of the Give Them an Argument podcast. I'm your host, Ben Burgis, and roaming somewhere in the chat is David Feldman, who is very nicely doing sound editing for the YouTube version, for the podcast version that people will eventually be hearing for this. Should also shout out to Forrest from Tnbs, who's doing the video editing for YouTube, and Cole James Cash, who provided intro music that, with any luck, if the timing comes together right, you're going to be hearing when people download this as a podcast or watch it on YouTube. The voice that you just heard, of course, was our departed brother, Michael Brooks, from his Mill Series lecture at Lafayette College. And I wanted to start out with that for a couple reasons. So one of them is just that it seemed right to me that be the first voice that you ever heard on this podcast, since it certainly wouldn't be happening if not for him. Both because months ago he told me that I should think about doing something like this, which says a lot about the man, that that he was a very ambitious person, but he was competing against past versions of himself. He was equally ambitious on behalf of his friends and comrades, and striving to enact the political project that he cared about so deeply. And also because I think that the way he sets things up in that clip is really good. I mean, the whole thing is great. Counting all the Q&A, it's like 2.5 hours. So I'm obviously not going to play that here, but everybody should look that up, the Mill Series lecture, and watch it. The way that he handles questions from people who are like, you know, college Democrat kind of people who are asking kind of annoying questions. But he could dismiss, he could grandstand, he could use his considerable rhetorical ability to just make them feel silly. But he doesn't do that. There's maybe a little moment of it when somebody asks him a ridiculous question about, you know, whether he was like a self-hating Jew for criticizing Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. And there's a little bit of snark at the beginning, justifiably, I thought, before he goes into his real answer. But even in that real answer, you can tell that he's always trying to think about what framing is going to make sense to the students, how he can not just score points with people who already like him, but he can intersect with their worldview. He can give them an argument that would actually mean something to them. And obviously he's one of the most gifted, you know, political communicators that we've had on the left in a very long time, which is one of many reasons the loss is irreplaceable. But another reason that I wanted to start out with that clip was because the analysis itself is really sharp, and it's going to directly tie into the first thing that I'm going to talk about today. So the first guest in just a couple of minutes is going to be Matt Leck, who, you know, that should be a name that if you watched the Michael Brooks show, and what's wrong with you, you know, if you never have, sorry, it'll be a wonderful new discovery if you never have. And when you do, you'll hear Michael say super producer Matt Leck about 10,000 times. See, James in the chat says he never has. You should. It's great. Like so much gold in there. But what I want to talk about with Matt has to do with some of the issues going around right now about you know, free speech and what's sometimes called cancel culture, as it impacts the very group of people that Michael is talking about in that clip, the so-called intellectual dark web. So this is a group of people that includes Jordan Peterson, who Michael was doing this kind of Kermit the Frog impression of earlier, which is always fantastic, and Ben Shapiro, who's much more of a conventional conservative. You know, he's also like 4 feet tall and has a really distinctive speaking pattern, and Dave Rubin, who is just kind of adult, you know, no reason to be dishonest about that. Sam Harris, who's less doltish than Rubin, is a neuroscientist, but falls into the same lazy habits of thought, the same absurd arguments as the rest of these guys do. And finally, last but not least, the Weinstein brothers, Brett and Eric. And I just want to stay on Michael for a minute because there's a passage from his book Against the Web, which again, I really strongly recommend that everybody read. It'll take you an afternoon. It's a short book. It's a fast read, but it's packed with like really interesting insight and analysis. No, not to be confused with Harvey and Bob Weinstein. These are different Weinstein brothers. And in that book, you know, there's a section where he starts talking about Quillette, and in general, that side of the culture war. So here's what he says: above and beyond everything else that's wrong with this kind of behavior, and what he's talking about is, you know, what's sometimes called cancel culture, some of the more excessive antics of certain kinds of student activists who don't have a good political strategy. He says it's an ongoing gift to our political enemies. Claire Lehman's magazine Quillette has printed nonsense about IQ that borders on a contemporary version of phrenology, the art and science of using skull measurement to determine personality traits and intelligence. It's published ridiculous capitalist apologetics, including a crude article by an Amazon warehouse worker defending the company's disgusting labor practices. It's also published a few good articles by leftists, like he mentions a couple, including me and our friend and comrade Mac McManus, who actually did a really interesting interview with Michael about his book for the Zero Books channel. You should also check that out. Who make a practice of going into enemy territory to argue for leftist ideas. Though I back them in their incursions, we should be crystal clear about Quillette's reactionary editorial line. But here is the key passage. Here's the thing, he says. Quillette and similar magazines don't attract attention to their toxic material because there's a massive pre-existing audience for their worst takes. Rather, they generate their readership by publishing a never-ending stream of, oh my God, look at these leftists being crazy articles. Does the right exaggerate and lie about these things? Sometimes. But these things really do happen from time to time as well, and when they do, they cause real problems. Entire careers are built on this nonsense. We wouldn't have ever heard of Bret Weinstein if not for what happened at Evergreen College. Far too much ink and podcast hours have been spent laboriously re-reviewing his version of the Evergreen drama, without attempting to relitigate the he said, she said of that situation this far out. I will say that I suspect my friend and editor, Doug Lane, was correct to ask whether an increasingly corporatized administration was playing divide and conquer by deflecting student anger away from real decision makers and onto a professor who was arrogant and tone deaf enough about the students' legitimate anger and activism to make for an easy target. The way that activists turn their attention to this ridiculous and thoroughly unimpressive person, who nonetheless has connections, turned him into a cause celeb for the right. Whatever else is true about all this, what matters most is that Bret and his brother Eric Weinstein are here with us now, pushing the right-wing classical liberal problem of the IDW. In a world where the left was just a little better at acting strategically, Bret may well still be teaching biology at a nice hippie liberal arts college, while Eric quietly did whatever it was he did for billionaire ghoul Peter Thiel. Doug Lane, who he mentioned in there, by the way, very thoughtfully after Michael passed, sent me this bottle of very nice, very smooth bourbon. Enjoying some of that right now while I record the episode. The Glenn Beck book, I will tell you about later in the episode. But I really like the way he sets things up there. And I am going to bring in Matt Leck now. So more. All right. So I really like the way that Michael sets it up in this passage, because what I want to get into in my conversation with Matt is the way that there are like a few different levels going on with this stuff. So when people in the IDW, this group that Michael was criticizing in the passage of the book and in the talk at Lafayette College, as well as criticizing the way the left plays into their hands by not being more strategic, when these guys talk about free speech and various things that might be threats to free speech, not everything they say is wrong, but it's also true that some of them are just hilariously amazing hypocrites about it. And it's also true that they don't really have any good solutions. And I want to get into both of those things. But first, Matt, how are you doing?
Hey, Ben, I'm doing all right. How about yourself? I like that you're doing the show. Congratulations on the first episode. I'm honored to be the first guest, actually. Very honored by that.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. And it makes sense to me since, so we've interacted so much, since from my debunk segment on Tnbs. Before we get into anything else, by the way, since some people might not be clear about, the Tnbs's future, do you want to speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, so David Griscom and Michael's sister Leisha Brooks and I will be sort of carrying on the mantle. We're going to basically continue the show. We're working it out now, how exactly we're going to do it. It's going to take a lot more responsibility from David and I, and it'd be helpful to have Leisha there, kind of giving us the idea of what the family kind of wants. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. I've been, doing a lot more different kinds of reading than I was before, trying to, because there's like I need to read the book on Thabo Mbeki. Michael always wanted me to read. It's a big task, but we want to keep these conversations going. So, and I'm sure I can speak for David in saying, Ben, you have an open door to wherever we go with it. So, yeah, thanks for asking.
Yeah, much appreciated. Yeah, just want people to know, because I think not everybody might be clear that that's still going to be continuing to exist and go on, which I'm really, really glad that it is. But speaking of which, since as well as Tnbs, you have a role at the Majority Report, and related to that, one of these guys, in fact, the guy who was the subject of that passage that we just read, Brett Weinstein, recently, I think, revealed something interesting about the depths of his commitment to free speech and the free exchange of ideas. So I want to just pull up here. Here, let's do the screen share so people can see this, because the whole thing is just amazing.
So in any case, we now have this dynamic, and unfortunately now what we are seeing is the potential of this mindset to disrupt leadership at a moment when everything seems to be at stake. And as I'm sure we will end up talking about, I had a contact this week, somebody who has been following us for quite some time contacted me. He's actually a Department of Homeland Security officer in Portland. And he contacted me, I think it's fair to say, in something of a panic based on what he is seeing unfold night after night for the last, 8 nights in Portland, a standoff between the protests and the police. And he frankly is worried about what might emerge from this. And among the possibilities are, a civil war based, in race, and it wouldn't be the first one of those, obviously. And so I really think we have to figure out how to escape the momentum of this moment. And without leaders, I don't know that we can do it, which means I think one of our primary concerns ought to be figuring out what to do when your leaders are trapped in the gig economy. How do you free them to actually do what leaders are supposed to do? In my opinion, the anarchists are actually looking for a massacre. And let me explain to you what I mean by that, because obviously the idea that anybody would seek to be massacred is ludicrous, and it is ludicrous. But you have how many major cities engaged in violent conflict on a daily basis now? If one of those cities sees a massacre, it does the job that the anarchists would like, right? It will be used to illustrate the illegitimacy and the overreaction of the government. At the point you surrender the idea that I am responsible for achievement, right? I am better off becoming part of a mob than I am being an individual responsible for my own achievement. Then this all begins to make sense. The point is, well, the mob will achieve something and then we'll divide it. Well, you know what's going to happen when the mob achieves it? It's going to be divided so unequally, right? If you think
the mob's going to be equitable,
right?
Really?
That's really the question. If you think the mob is going to be equitable, you don't understand the game theory that underlies mobs. They're taking advantage of you in order to get where they want to go. And as soon as they do, they'll cut you loose, which is, of course, what explains this phenomenon that everybody is now remarking on about the left eating its own. Right? The left eats its own because it is too prone to de-individuation and mob-like behavior. And when the spoils are there to be divided, they're divided the way human beings would be expected to divide them in the absence of a system that aspires to fairness.
There's this clip of Brett Weinstein talking about the situation in Portland. And as people might know, the protests, in Portland, as some of the kind of longest running instances of the continuing embers of the national uprising of protests and riots since the murder of George Floyd, has been met with a pretty severe government response. Not just what we've seen around the country, which has been local cops, beating people up, beating journalists up, firing rubber bullets, at people, who are peacefully protesting. You've seen that all over the place, but in Portland, seen some more disturbing stuff too. There were literally instances of the Department of Homeland Security usurping local law enforcement functions, as well as severely violating people's free speech rights, if that's something we cared about, by using these really like banana republic kind of intimidation tactics where they would grab protesters off the street and shove them into unmarked vans that are obviously designed to make people feel very afraid about going to protests.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would think that as somebody whose whole brand is built around his dedication to free speech, Brett would be outraged about this, and you'd think that his commentary on this would be devoted to denouncing this and explaining why those of us who care about free speech. Hey Harvey, I'm going to stick you in the peanut gallery for a minute while I talk to Matt.
I didn't mean to.
No worries, no worries. Gonna pull up Harvey again in a few minutes. But in any case, you'd think that would be his big concern here, right? If there's anything, like whatever we think about threats to free speech from employers, from certain kinds of social ostracism, from things that might cause self-censorship, like the core of free speech is exactly about this, right? Like, exactly about this issue. So you'd think that this would be his big concern here. So what was it?
Well, I mean, his concern throughout this has really been in the rioting sort of thing. And he's sort of, I always talk about it as the sort of, look what you made me do Taylor Swift song gambit of reactionaries, which is that Brett, he has this, I call it a pose. I don't consider him, I think it's the Dave Rubin, I'm a man who left the left type of thing. I don't want this to be happening, but nonetheless, the weak executive not allowing tear gas is going to facilitate the need for something fatal. And actually so I posted this clip of the episode 21, the June 6th episode of the Dark Horse podcast, of him saying this DHS guy who he said followed him for a while, came up and said, I'm really panicked. And this is just loose quotation here, but I'm panicked about potential race war. And later on in the episode, Brett says, my opinion is that the anarchists who have taken over the Black Lives Matter movement are game theory incentivized to use this moment of weak executive to try to facilitate a race or a massacre somewhere. Maybe not where they are, but they just want one somewhere so then we can really have the revolution. And I thought this was an alarming thing a conversation to have with a DHS agent on June 6th. This was
footnote. It's hilarious that that there was the thing about game theory in there, like just to kind of give it this paranoid right-wing lunacy about race war, this like sheen of like intellectualism, that's like, oh no, but I'm a math nerd, I'm just thinking about game theory.
Yeah. So I took part of this clip, and it's all it starts about 12 minutes in on the June 6th episode. If people want to check it out, but I quoted that, and I admittedly, a bit facetiously called that his consulting work with DHS. Now he took that as, I guess, borderline slanderous or libel, because he said, he tweeted out, Matt Leck is spreading knowing falsehoods. He said falsehoods.
The falsehood, to be clear, is that he was getting paid for this rather than doing this as a freelance volunteer.
Yeah, I would say it was unpaid consultation and not consulting work. I should have said that. That as a journalist, I should have said that. I agree, because it gave him a little pedantic point to complain about, which is, I think, the pattern of these guys. If I could just go through this. So Dave Rubin complained that a video that I actually titled, but we call him stupid in video too. Like we call Dave Rubin stupid, so he couldn't engage with us in ideas. Fair enough. But we got painted as bad for that. Meanwhile, years later, it looks like Joe Rogan and half the IDW agree with that. And then so we got it. That was the first member of the IDW that demanded an apology of Sam Cedar as a precondition for a conversation. The second was Sam Harris. Because he went on Weinstein's Portal podcast and called Sam a psychopathic troll. This is during us criticizing his bell curve stuff, rehabilitating Charles Murray. And I will just say, the Weinstein brothers are better on the bell curve stuff. They point out why, but they're not explicit in their criticism of who they're criticizing. But I'm just saying, if you would have came to us more directly, we could have had this conversation. You wouldn't have to be distancing yourself from bell curve stuff all these years later.
Just to make sure everybody's listening really knows what you're talking about here, right? Like that's so Charles Murray famously wrote this book back in the 90s with Edward Bernstein called The Bell Curve, where the overall thesis of the book is that the main cause for like economic inequality was that I'm simplifying a little bit, but I think if you slog through the book, you'll find that this is not inaccurate. It's a simplification, but that's all it is. Is that poor people are stupid, and in particular, there's a famous chapter in there where he looks directly at the most obvious counterexample, which is, hey, Black people have been doing economically worse than white people since emancipation. And, you might think that has something to do with slavery and Jim Crow and FHA redlining. But nope. It's because of difference in IQ. And Sam Harris really ran with this, like after there was some incident where there was a college that Murray was supposed to speak at, and it was disrupted, and there's a whole thing there. But instead of just saying, "Hey, you shouldn't disrupt speakers," but also Charles Murray is a crazy and terrible person, who's peddling,
who's not a scientist, right? He's
not a scientist in any way.
He's a political agent. Basically.
Yeah, he's a right-wing think tank guy, right? He's not he spent his entire life in these kinds of institutions putting out right-wing policy books. He's not a scientist. He's just looking for scientific rationalization for the kind of Dickensian economic preferences that he has. And so instead of saying all that, right, Harris really embraced him, said,
to debate Ezra Klein on it, which was, everyone should check that out. A pretty amazing debate where he says, Ezra, I can't remember the IQ guy who they both cite, but Ezra at one point cited him saying it could be that, there's so much environmental stuff that we just don't know the genetic component. And Sam Harris is yeah, but we're talking about what's plausible here. And I mean, it's a very interesting debate. People should go back and watch
it is.
that.
And actually, it's even better than that, because in that moment, it's like the Marshall McLuhan scene in Annie Hall, that Ezra Klein actually says, this guy you're talking about with this effect, the Flynn effect. That's
Flynn,
right.
Michael Flynn. Or, not Michael Flynn, jeez. No,
not Michael Flynn, but a different Flynn, a scientist Flynn. And this Flynn, Ezra Klein actually says, I just talked to him last night to see what he thinks about this, and this is what he says. Yeah. And Harris just treats that like it has no bearing, and he's still reading Flynn right. And most of the debate is spent with Klein trying to challenge him on the merits and explain why he's wrong, and Harris whining about how we can't have the conversation, which kind of sets the tone, right? So after you tweeted this thing about Brett Weinstein's unpaid, unofficial, but friendly conversations with DHS agents worried about race war as the DHS is nabbing protesters off the street and sticking them in unmarked vans.
Or even right before that happened, actually. That's what made that a bit weird to see, because the nabbings happened a few weeks after. But Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So you tweeted this, and of course, like an adult, he just tweeted, "Hey Matt, I think the way you put that was slightly inaccurate. Would you
I'd love to come
consider-"
onto the majority report and correct the record. That didn't happen.
No, that did not. What happened instead?
He called for me to be fired. He called for me to apologize, retract, and then be fired. Which is like, if I'm going to be fired, like, I'm not going to do any of that.
Why are you going to do all that, first, right?
But I did. I immediately deleted it because, like I said earlier, I wish I hadn't done that because, and I just want to get back to this pattern I got sidetracked with the Sam Harris thing. So Sam Harris, said we won't engage with us because we're psychopathic. He said that our behavior was psychopathic on Eric Weinstein's The Portal. Anyway, flashback to about a week before this happens with Brett Weinstein. Sam Cedar is dunking on Eric Weinstein for saying that he understands what it's like to be black because he's neurodivergent, and people tell him he's wrong about things a lot. And Sam says that, hey, Eric, awesome. I know I'm a psychopathic troll, in quotes. I know you think I'm a psychopathic troll, in quotes, blah, 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 blah. And Eric seizes on saying, I have never said you are a psychopathic troll, but I'd be happy to say I'm wrong if you can provide evidence. And he has like the screenshots of like the Boolean operator search terms. It's like, oh, clearly never said it. But again, Sam Harris went onto his show and called us psychopathic. And Eric said, oh, that's what the whole left is doing these days. That was his pushback to that. And then Eric did call us, says our troll game is too strong for him to engage. So that's the third IDW member of the ones profiled by Barry Weiss that demanded an apology as a precondition for discussion. And then a week later, Brett asked for me to. Admittedly, I was provoking him because I think his behavior. But come on. I mean, like the idea that it's okay to try to get people fired to silence them if the speech is provocative enough. Right.
Once you said that, it's kind of game over as far as everything these guys are, in some cases, legitimately, right, complaining about. And also, by the way, I just love the idea of the person being called psychopathic in this context. Is that monster Sam Cedar, right? Like,
it's so weird. This whole time period is crazy.
Human beings.
Well, to be fair, he does like to fight with these guys, so I understand from their perspective why he presents or appears that way. Because he has a greater appetite than either Michael or I do for this stuff, which is why I'm grateful to work for him. Because Sam, when I tweeted my response to Brett, I tweeted out and I put the video back up, but tweeted out some apologies and some other context. And throughout that entire thing, Sam, I wasn't like talking to Sam. I wasn't coordinating what I can say. I'm confident in my job at the Majority Report, my place there, that Sam's going to have my back, and I appreciate that.
Well,
so.
Yeah, and of course, the idea that you would be coordinated it does get right to the heart of the issue because a lot of times, again, these guys are clearly not taking it's only censorship if the state doesn't line, right? If they were, there'd be nothing inconsistent about trying to get you fired for a tweet they didn't like. But they're not, right? Because if they were, then like 3/4 of what they object to would be unobjectionable. You could no longer say that you didn't like it, that this editor had to step down or this professor was investigating. None of that stuff, right? Because none of that is the state. Mm-hmm. So they are obviously concerned about tactics like trying to get people fired to punish them for their speech. And the fact that they're willing to engage in that themselves like this tells you everything about how serious they are about it, right? That they'll resort to that easily.
Well, he recently said on a more recent episode that this is different because I'm like a drunk pilot and you can't really have mistakes of this significance. So I guess mischaracterizing and I guess suggesting a more formal relationship between him and the race war panicked Department of Homeland Security officer in Portland, like driving a plane into the Andes Mountains. But
no, absolutely. And of course, also the suggestion, you're like a drunk pilot, like, I love you and like, I think you do great work, but I also think that flying an airplane and being a producer for some talk shows maybe aren't really analogous activities?
I don't know. I'll have to think about that one.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But yeah, I also think just as, certainly I think you're less likely to kill people in your line of work. I'll say that much.
I mean, I think so. I mean, to address that point seriously, he says like in this environment, you don't want to be spreading misinformation like that, which I mean, I have some agreement with that sort of thing, which is why I changed my tweet. Now, I find it a bit rich that the main journalist he always cites, and immediately after talking about this DHS conversation, is Andy Ngo. That's like his only source on the ground. And I mean, Andy Ngo's been criticized for things he's published about hospitalized protesters and journalists. So, I mean, I think these conversations are valid, but I kind of don't buy it so much from Brett Weinstein in that case. I don't think I really endangered him. I think telling the DHS about anarchists that want to start a race war is also a bit irresponsible in these times.
Yeah, possibly even more irresponsible than not making it clear that he didn't have a title and wasn't being paid for the conversation. But it's also important, and I guess maybe this is like the last point I want to end this on, because above and beyond the fact that they're like weird hypocritical clowns, there's also a more serious thing here, which is that if you are concerned about people using these tactics, like trying to get people fired, for tweeting things you don't like, then, if you're not just going to be complaining pointlessly forever, right? You should have some kind of solutions. And I'll also even say some people on the left like err in the direction of not taking those concerns seriously enough. But I also think the left is in a position to have solutions that none of the rest of these, none of these like IDW so-called classical liberal people actually have, because if you really cared about this problem, which I think you should, then gosh, I don't know, maybe you'd like want to reform labor law so we don't have at-will employment and you have to have a cause for being fired, or make it easier to organize labor unions so you'll have like, somebody to defend you, if you're about to be unjustly fired. And, not to like beat this particular dead horse too much, none of those guys ever talk about any of that stuff, at least.
Right. Yeah. One thing I keep thinking about is in all the conservative freak out about the 1619 project, conservatives aren't freaked out enough to air the Adolf Reed critique of it, which is,
yeah, exactly. Right. Like you have, Sam Harris brings Adolf Reed on Waking Up, then I'll believe that he's actually interested.
Right, exactly. Any one of these guys, let's see it happen. I mean, first of all, I think Adolf might be a bit suspect of going on with those guys himself. I don't know. I don't want to speak for him, but I would love to see it happen. I would love to see them extend the invitation. Let's just say that.
Yeah, I mean, look, it'd be understandable if he did, but for a lot of reasons, I love that particular conversation. If for those who haven't read it, a gem from, I believe, The Nation in the 90s is Adolf Reed's original review of the bell curve. He's very funny about it in exactly the ways that you'd expect him to be, and it's worth reading.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was great.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Good luck on the endeavor.
All right. Thanks, man.
See you.
Harvey. You're muted.
I'm unmuted.
Outstanding. How are you doing today, Harvey?
I'm okay. I'm doing all right. We've had storms come through. The humidity's high, but I've been looking forward to seeing you, so I'm feeling good.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to pop in the middle of that. I didn't know how to get into that.
No worries. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of that. That's totally fine. Yeah, no, I'm excited to talk to you. We've overlapped, a bit on the Michael Brooks show, and I had a good conversation with you in Brooklyn when there was the last live show.
Yeah.
But I've never really had a good chance to pick your brain about the stuff that you're most that you're most passionate about radical history and what we can learn from the radical tradition in American history, which is really what I was hoping to talk to you about today. So one way to kind of enter into this is, I don't know if you've ever read Philip Roth's novel, I Married a Communist.
I haven't. No,
Okay.
I'm a very poorly read person in literature.
In literature, very, very well read in history. Fair enough. So in that book, there's, you know, a lot of it's about the, as the title might suggest, the American Communist Party and McCarthyism, and, you know, Roth's anger at, you know, McCarthyite witch hunters. But one thing that actually comes up pretty extensively in the book is that these like 1930s kind of Popular Front era communists were really obsessed with Thomas Paine, right?
Yes.
So why? Yeah, I was
Does
wondering
that actually
if
come up? Does that come up in the novel?
that comes up extensively in the novel.
You just made it that I have to read it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you'll enjoy the book. It's very good. But I guess I think it might be an interesting jumping off point for some of what we were talking about. Like why is it that, like, out of all of the, you know, the founders, you know, the American revolutionaries, why is it that Paine is one who the American left, you know, radicals have historically been so interested in?
Okay, that is a good question, and it can be answered in a sort of direct sort of list way. For example, he never owned slaves. How's that for a start?
I mean, that's a pretty good start.
Okay, number one. Number two, his first significant intervention, when he came over from England, and he was already almost middle aged, he secured a job which was completely a complete sort of new thing for him as the editor of a new magazine in Philadelphia. And he wrote a lot of things, but the very first thing he wrote of a direct political intervention sort was actually a call to bring an end to slavery in America. Okay, and it wasn't one of those things that said we should end slavery and send African Americans or Africans back to Africa. It wasn't a colonizationist. He actually talked about the responsibility of providing education and land. So, okay, that's worthy. So that's first of all. And by the way, Thomas Paine's writings were never out of print. And in the 1930s, the entire left was reading Thomas Paine, from the liberals of the FDR New Deal administration over to the Communist Party. And in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt, just as a sidebar to that, Eleanor Roosevelt herself wrote a little book titled Moral Democracy, something like that. And it was all about the American tradition. And it's pretty clear that she was reading communist writers to enhance her ability to write about democracy. And the person she quoted the most, I think she devotes 5 pages in a 100-page book to Thomas Paine. So indeed, Philip Roth was right on to make something of Paine. And I do have to read the novel. But it is the case that in every generation in American history, when radicals or even liberals, progressives, whatever we want to call them, whenever they united for struggle, whether it was for free thought, that is to make sure that the separation of church and state was really a separation of church and state, abolitionists, feminists, labor unionists, socialists, progressives, anarchists, who am I leaving out as we go along? But you've got the idea. Every single struggle, they always reach back to the revolution. There is that kind of sort of instinctive reaching back to the revolution in order to, if you like, bolster or validate their cause. And when you reach back to the revolution, inevitably, you not only go to the Declaration's words, okay, all men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you end up necessarily discovering and recovering Thomas Paine. I mean, Thomas Paine, you know, in school they teach you that Thomas Paine was the author of a pamphlet that incited the struggle for independence, or turned the struggle that was a rebellion into a revolution. But it's not just a revolution for independence. In fact, Paine once said, if the struggle was only about independence, it wouldn't have been worth pursuing. There was something like that. But the fact was that Paine actually argued for something that was rather unprecedented at the time, and that is he argued for creating a democratic republic. So if you go back to Thomas Paine and you're reading this pamphlet, which really does make the case that that Americans had, excuse this for, and most people on the left would get upset when I mention this, that Americans had a world historic opportunity to fight for human rights, not simply for British rights or for what might well be called later after the Constitution, American rights. And among the lines he offers is, we have it in our power to begin the world over again,
Yeah.
which has got to be the most absolutely true and absolutely untrue statement at one and the same time. As a debunker,
Yeah, it's also a nice echo there to the lyric from Solidarity Forever, right? You know, we have power to make a new world out of the ashes of the old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but I just want to point out that when
yeah.
he says that, he actually talks about never since the time of Noah have we had the opportunity to start over again, that kind of thing. And what really makes it significant is not just, I mean, Paine wasn't simply, a genius writer. He wasn't just, he was a working class man, basically.
Yeah.
But what it is that he could speak in such a way that everyone understood, or he could write so that everyone understood him. And moreover, and this is really the thing that I think is important, is that he actually was sort of holding up a mirror to Americans as to what they were already doing in their rebellion. So he never claimed any originality, and essentially that's what he was doing. And I want to make it clear that if we think about the greatest of the revolutionary writers, and if we go next, say, to Karl Marx, I mean, if one reads Das Kapital is
not riveting reading.
Okay.
It's got its moments, but it's not a page turner.
Right. I mean, I never bother to have my students read Capital or even the economic and philosophical manuscripts, because I'm talking about freshmen and sophomores going on. But to read the Communist Manifesto is to read something which is both historically questionable and historically true. He really is talking about what he sees taking place in the course of mid-19th century Europe, and sees the possibilities that are emergent there. And basically that's what Paine did. He saw the struggles underway, and he was saying to Americans, do you realize what you're doing? I mean, I'm paraphrasing. So that's why in every generation, when people look back to the revolution, they can find a fundamental, hardcore, if you like, call for democratic revolution. And to whatever extent Americans remain, as I like to believe, radicals at heart, it links to that kind of Thomas Paine pamphleteering.
Yeah, and I think that's like really good to know and really good to think about. Because I always get a little annoyed, like, we aren't recording this that many weeks after the 4th of July, that there's like a certain kind of like leftist whose like response to that holiday is to is to sort of say, oh, actually the American Revolution was like really bad, because they were all, slaveholders and this, that, and the other thing, some of which is true, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. But I always think that it's not entirely true, and it's definitely not like the emphasis, right, I think is wrong. That of course you shouldn't whitewash any of that, but instead of sort of disdaining that, right? Like if instead you could say, look, okay, first of all, don't be a weirdo about this. Have a hot dog, enjoy some fireworks, drink some, drink some whiskey, but enjoy the people you love, don't be like the guy who's off the side muttering about it. But also, instead of saying it's all that, right? You could say, look, some of it is, but there are also these strands in that history. There's also, part of the stated ideals of that revolution, and certainly the best of the revolutionaries, like Paine, that, there are a lot of points of continuity between that and what we want, right? That like one way of thinking, and I think Marx had a complicated relationship to this idea. Sometimes he talked this way, sometimes he criticized talking this way, but certainly in my view, right, that like one way to think about the relationship between those kind of historical liberal democratic revolutions and what we want right now, to create a more humane, more democratic, more economically equal, certainly society, is about fulfilling kind of the unfinished business of those earlier democratic revolutions. And I think the Paine stuff like ties into that in a really powerful way. One thing I really specifically wanted to hone in on in terms of thinking about different demands that people have made, even going back to then, right, is that Paine, as I understand it, is essentially, and I'm sure you can disambiguate this, right, but like in a sense, right, is like a early advocate of something that is in some ways analogous to like a universal basic income. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, and the reason I pull back for two reasons
Yeah,
when I hear that.
yeah.
One, to recall our dear friend Michael, is I would say that Michael said, well, what about this Andrew Wang universal basic income? What would Paine say? And this came up when I was on Rising. Crystal wanted to know, and I said, I'm not going to deny that one could derive an argument for universal basic income from Thomas Paine's arguments. But I think it's to avoid what Thomas Paine was really arguing for. I mean, Thomas Paine was the father of social democracy. And in the pamphlet, first of all, in his 2-volume pamphlet, Rights of Man, he moves decidedly in favor of social democracy. And because he says that if we can get rid of, because he's now back in England for a while, if we can get rid of the monarchy and the aristocracy and think of the wealth that will be saved and think of the things we can do to attack poverty and lift up working people. But the other thing is, and this is even more important, in Agrarian Justice, written a few years later in the 1790s, Thomas Paine actually says that, and he was a deist, not an atheist. As a deist, he believed God had created the universe and the earth, and that he offered the creation as something we all had a share in. That is, all were to share in that. And as a consequence, those who have come to monopolize the land, and keep in mind land and agriculture were the fundamentals in the late 18th century, those who come to occupy and own, possess all this land, they owe us a payment. They owe us a tax. They owe not just an individual kind of payment, but they owe the entire community or nation a payment. So he said what needs to happen is we need to create a fund, call it a community trust in the monopoly game version, or a national treasury, and the taxes to be paid into there should be used for two kinds of projects, or two kinds of programs, better said. One, every young person, and Paine was a feminist, or at least a proto-feminist. He had been very close to Mary Wollstonecraft during the years of the French Revolution. She was very much inspired by him. He said we should make sure that every young person, whether man or woman, boy or girl, on reaching the age of maturity should be given a grant, a sum of money, which would enable them, to get an education or to buy land themselves or to set up in a business. That way you prevent poverty, period, okay? And then he said the other part of that fund should be used for the purpose of what in the 1930s or 20s they called old age pensions. We come to know as Social Security. And he's basically saying when people reach the age of, he didn't use the word retirement, 55, whatever it might be, that they should be given money so that they can live comfortably. So Paine is a social democrat. Okay, he didn't argue for dispossessing the landed, although I read a really good argument several years ago that said that Paine was really sort of saying, do this, landed folks, or we're going to come for your land next.
Right.
Okay, so in any case, so he's a social democrat. Now, the other part of the problem with UBI is that, as I remember saying to Michael, was that I can readily imagine, speaking of landed people, that landlords would immediately grab hold of the UBI payment by raising their rents on people.
Right.
So it should be the case that what we're talking, it should be a kind of social democratic thing. And by the way, I mean, social democracy today, we could readily imagine, for example, I mean, think about taking Paine's ideas and expanding. So everyone talks about Medicare for all, and the Democrats like Biden are doing the wimpy version of it. Well, we'll reduce the age of Medicare from 65 to 60. But how about if we say that everyone under the age of 18 has free healthcare? Let's start there. That would be to combat poverty at the beginning and to enable people at the beginning. I mean, look, I'd go for Medicare. I don't even know if I'd stay at Medicare for all. I like to think of it something called all-American healthcare. We're all covered. We pay our taxes, and we don't have to worry. Okay. Like
Britain's NHS, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Having lived in England, I don't know if you've ever lived over there, but living over there was, when I went to the dentist, it was taken care of. When I got mononucleosis, it was taken care of.
Yeah, I haven't lived there, but my sister is married to a British guy, and she's lived there for many years, and I've certainly been over to visit. And yeah, I mean, there's something that's incredibly liberating about living in that system, having the NHS card, knowing that like you're never going to be charged, or I mean, really the only like even now, right? Like with all of the inroads, from Thatcher through New Labour, to Boris Johnson, all the inroads into that system and all the chipping away at it. Even now, right? Like the only money you're actually going to be charged in NHS hospitals for parking, and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, when he was leading it, at least, I don't know if they still are, but one of their election demands was to abolish the parking fees, because you shouldn't even have that, right? Imagine having that be your problem. But I guess one thread I did want to connect there, right? When you're talking about Thomas Paine, kind of as a proto-social democrat, in his support for various kinds of redistribution, like something like Social Security and so on. And I think making some very perceptive points about the problems with like Yang-style UBI proposals. And actually, I'd even add into that another problem with those proposals is that most of what little leverage ordinary people have within our economic system comes from their ability to organize in the workplace. And if you don't even, if that's even that isn't there, right, then you're really in trouble, right? I mean, I kind of start thinking about, pretentious reference, I know, but run with me, I start thinking about like in the late Roman Republic when, big landed estates, bought up like most of the small farms. And so you had all these people who were small farmers who were living in Rome and as paupers and just living on like the daily bread ration, like that's kind of what I think of sometimes.
Yeah. And I'll just mention in favor of Thomas Paine once again in that regard, that Paine would never have even come to the American colonies in 1775. It had not been for the fact that when he had been working, he was actually working for the government at the time. He was an excise officer. And this was a very low paid, highly dangerous position. And his fellow excise officers knew of his talent with words, hearing him recite poetry, perhaps in a pub, something like that. And they asked him if he would actually lead a campaign to petition the government and the Excise Commission to raise the wages of the excise officers. And in his courageous foolishness, he said yes. And he went off to London. He wrote a petition, a 5-page petition on the needs of the case of the excise officers. Now, this, by the way, was utterly illegal, not just because he left his post, even more significantly, any notion of combining in the form of labor agitation and a labor union was utterly illegal. So here he is in London petitioning and lobbying, and eventually he, by the way, met a lot of very important people, all of whom embraced him, but the government was outraged and they fired him, or as the English say, they sacked him. And he basically had become friendly with Benjamin Franklin, who spent a good deal of his own life in London. And Franklin said, maybe it's time, you have an interest in America, maybe it's time you go over to America. So in essence, he's the labor organizer or labor unionist who gets sacked and decides he's going to start a revolution, you might say. So.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I did not know that story. That's wonderful. On the, and speaking of labor, so I guess one thing, that I also wanted to tie this into was that, there's been this kind of longstanding, pre-Andrew Yang, right, debate on the left about whether the idea that we should have some kind of like universal support for having some kind of livelihood should take the form of something like a UBI, or it should take the form of something like a universal jobs guarantee, which is also, I know, something that I've heard you talk about before, and we've only got a minute now, but I really hope you're going to come back to talk more about this with me.
I'll be back all the time to be with you.
All right. So in and this other demand, this universal jobs guarantee, this jobs for all demand, is something that was historically advocated by a lot of the civil rights movement. So in the civil sorry. In that case, right? Like one thing I remember, for example, right? So when I was, and this is actually perfect, right? If you heard that digging, that was Bhaskar telling me that that he's going to be like another 10 minutes, which I'm glad about, because that means
nice.
that means that we can follow this thread, right? You know, so
Yeah, I thought he was asking in, and then it would have been all the better 2 generations of socialists, but that's beside.
yeah, absolutely. And so in any case, like I remember, for example, right? So you know, I grew up in a time period where, you know, maybe not in every state, but at least in Michigan where I grew up, you know, there, you know, we got a fair amount of, like, you know, there'd be like a Martin Luther King Day assembly where you'd hear like a certain amount of about the civil rights movement, and it was all good, but it was all also in retrospect severely incomplete. So in a lot of ways, right? One of the most obvious of which is that it tended to skip from the March on Washington to Martin Luther King's assassination, right? Which happens 4 years later. So you never heard, you know, like a phrase that I never heard in any of these assemblies was "Poor People's Campaign." You know, for example, I also never heard the word Vietnam, right? You know, mentioned in these contexts. You know, because again, the version that they teach school kids, you know, like basically skips anything that would still be controversial. And one thing I even remember, like some old social studies textbook when I was growing up, that you know, was looking, you know, what they tell you about the March of Washington is basically the "I Have a Dream" speech, but they're accompanying pictures, they're photos of the march, and in those photos, one thing that you notice that's really interesting, if you look closely, is how many of the signs have UAW on them, right? United Auto Workers.
That's right.
And another thing that you might realize till later is that they very rarely give you the full name of the march, which is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, we could spend the whole next half hour, and I don't want to take up Bhaskar's time, but here's the thing. And I want to go back to the 1940s. We can even go to the 30s.
Yeah, do it.
But in 1944, FDR gave what really is sort of the culmination of his entire presidency, in the sense that even as a candidate in 32, he was calling for an economic declaration of rights. In 1941, he issued his very famous State of the Union message, which included a call for the 4 freedoms, which included freedom from want and freedom from fear. But in 1944, he calls for the creation of an economic Bill of Rights. And one of those rights, and I actually knew this might come up, okay? It was the right to a useful and remunerative job and the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing, etc. In other words, the right to a job and the right to a job at a living wage, which he first argued for in 1933. Now, what's really important here is that he repeated the fact that this was meant to be an economic Bill of Rights for all Americans. Everyone knows the FDR administration did not make a big issue of civil rights. The FDR administration believed the idea was you would do a unit, whatever it would be universal. And that was his way, literally, of trying to create civil rights for all of his failings. Now, A. Philip Randolph always heard these things, and he always responded to FDR, and they knew each other. And when the FDR administration began to prepare for the post-war years, they actually called for full employment, which was to say the right to a job. Now, in 1963, it's A. Philip Randolph, the black civil rights and decidedly labor leader, who was himself a socialist, who actually organized
the Sleeping Car Porters Union, right?
Right, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, right. And they're the organizers of the March on Washington. And people should try to read Randolph's own speech that day. And by the way, Martin Luther King was not involved in organizing it, though he gave the speech that has become the iconic speech of the day. Now, it's also worth noting, if we go back to 1943-44, that Martin Luther King Jr. was a very young, brilliant, precocious kid, and he entered university at like 14 or 15 years of age. And he was one of the major black colleges. All of a sudden I'm blanking, down in Atlanta, not far from where you are. What's that?
Morehouse?
Morehouse,
right?
thank you very much.
Yep.
Morehouse. And while he was there, A. Philip Randolph came to Morehouse and did a short residency and did a series of lectures. And this was also the time, of course, of FDR's Economic Bill of Rights speech. And King's father was very much a pro-Roosevelt. I can't call him a Democrat because that would imply a Southern Democrat, but he decided this was a New Deal family, okay? So Martin Luther King clearly is cultivating in his own mind an idea of social democracy or democratic socialism. So when we come to 1963, you've got A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King, and Walter Reuther, as you said, UAW leader, who is literally the guy who writes the checks to underwrite the March on Washington that brought 250,000 people to DC. And here's the next thing. In the following year after that speech, and soon, you get Martin Luther King will soon, after the Civil Rights Act is enacted and the voting rights, he's going to pursue the Poor People's Campaign. And he's also going to have issued a Minority People's Bill of Rights call. Similarly, A. Philip Randolph issues a freedom budget. And the freedom budget is literally a call to end poverty and make freedom from want true in America. And it includes over and over again the imperative of full employment, basically a guaranteed right to a job. If not in private industry, then decidedly the federal government will create those jobs, not make work jobs, but serious jobs, paying a living wage. So this is all tied together. And by the way, I'll just leave it at this and we can argue about this sometime. I think it would be imperative right now for socialists, DSA and others, to do everything in their power to connect to the Black Lives Matter movement in the spirit of A. Philip Randolph and create this demand for social democracy. I think it's imperative.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So in fact, I mean, actually, the more I've thought about it lately, the more that slogan, right, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom seems brilliant to me, because it connects together the particularities of the movement for full civil and legal equality for Black people. You know, that's the freedom part, and doesn't, you know, without dismissing that or saying that's not important or that'll have to wait or anything like that. But also, instead of just having it be narrowly about that, right? You know, it's tied into an economic agenda that is certainly going to disproportionately benefit Black people, because Black people have been disproportionately screwed over by the economic system in the United States. You know, all the reasons I was talking about earlier with Matt, you know, when we were talking about the bell curve, but also, right, you know, it's screwed over a lot of other people too, right? You know, that you can build a broad cross-racial alliance around a lot of these things. That's not just a matter of altruism, right? Like, oh, this guy over here is suffering, you should be a good person, you should help him, right? Which of course that's great too, right? But like, it's particularly politically powerful when you can say, hey, we've all been screwed over by this system, and here's an agenda that's going to correct that for all of us, right? You know, there's a reason, you know, that, I mean, King knew what he was doing with the Poor People's Campaign, that just referenced poor people in general, right? You know, that a vastly larger portion of Black people than white people, you know, were and are living in poverty because of the economic legacy of America's history of de jure racial apartheid. But it's also true, right, that lots and lots and lots of other people are poor. And what you want to do, you know, if you're not just sort of more, you know, trying to make a moral statement, you're actually trying to change the world, right, is to try to make the biggest, broadest alliances that you can around shared interests. Say, you know, if we're all being screwed over, right, you know, let's work together without neglecting those important points about, you know, civic and legal equality, whether that means ending segregation or it means, you know, finishing the unfinished business of that 60s rights revolution when it comes to things like racial bias and law enforcement. But instead of leaving it there, right? Because there's something a little bit odd about that view, right? That like we should be happy if the percentage of people who are begging in the street from each racial group, right, was proportional to the population, right? That would count as a victory, or that, you know, the number of people who are in the number of people who are victimized by the police, even, right? Because like when we talk about George Floyd, you know, whose murder started that wave of protests, you know, riots, you know, civil disturbance, that I think it's important to remember that the specific context that this happened in was, you know, Floyd, you know, was a black worker who had been laid off, you know, because of coronavirus, and what he was choked to death for was trying to pass a bad $20 bill, right? So that this is a, you know, this is a symptom of a lot of social pathologies, but certainly, even though the poverty is itself unevenly distributed between different racial groups because of all this history we've been talking about, it's also just a symptom of poverty per se, and it's a symptom of the way that there's been this calculation that, you know, that was made, you know, in elite circles, you know, especially, especially starting in, you know, the 80s and in the Reagan era, and, you know, continuing after that, that rather than expanding what little social democracy we've had in America to try to reduce poverty, instead it would be both politically and financially cheaper to focus on more aggressive policing, a bigger carceral state, to carcerally manage the symptoms of poverty. That, you know, that in other words, you know, there are all these social ills that go with, you know, extreme poverty and economic inequality, and if you're not going to do anything about the underlying conditions, right, you know, then you can at least like lock up a lot of the people, you know, who have, you know, who are experiencing and trying to cope, you know, with the things that come from that.
Right.
And there's a line I just wanted to read you. You know, Bhaskar's going to be on in just a couple minutes, but there's a article. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but if not, I'd really recommend it. It's by the historian I'm sure you're familiar with, Barbara Fields, and it's in Dissent magazine. It's called "The Death of Hannah Pfizer," and there's this paragraph in there that I just love, which is, therefore, those seeking genuine democracy must fight like hell to convince white Americans that what is good for black people is also good for them. Reining in murderous police, investing in schools rather than prisons, providing universal health care, including drug treatment and rehabilitation for addicts in the rural heartland, raising taxes on the rich, and ending foolish wars are policies that would benefit a solid majority of the American people. Such an agenda could be the basis for a successful political coalition rooted in the real conditions of American life, which were disastrous before the pandemic and are now catastrophic. And that seems like a really powerful statement to me of the kind of politics that I think you're suggesting with these, you know, like talking about what we could learn from the civil rights movement and the way that it managed to, you know, to tie in these demands for full civic and legal equality for everybody, which are incredibly important, with the demand that instead of just distributing misery in a fairer way, we do something about the misery itself.
I'm gonna give you the way to, you can segue, okay? We'll wrap it up with this. Martin Luther King, in the years in 67, in fact, made it a point of indicating in one of his books that the quote that he turned to when times were particularly tough was Thomas Paine's words, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again."
There we go. Perfect.
Right.
So thank you so much, Harvey. We are going to have to do this again very soon. I got a lot out of this conversation. This is good. We need to talk again.
Okay, you bet. Thank you very much. Give my best to Bhaskar.
All right, will do, Harvey. There we go. You found it.
Hey, how are you? Sorry about the slight delay.
No problem.
You know, in my culture, no, I'm just kidding. I'm from New York. I have no real excuse.
Oh, fair enough.
I'm sorry. I just didn't want to be subjected to your white male temporality. That was really what this was about.
I really I should be apologizing for subjecting you to that temporality by texting you to see if you're ready.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to do better.
Yeah. I'm excited for this podcast, though. This is great. This is really needed. There's not enough left-wing podcasts out there, but no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. This should be great. Your lineup to start off at least is good.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that where you, well, actually, I guess you're not right this second, maybe, but but in where you normally live, I think that there are neighborhoods where you can't throw a rock without hitting a podcaster. But nevertheless, hope this offers something valuable. Certainly got a lot out of the conversation with Harvey about the history of American social democracy, and I just watched a great stay-at-home that you did for Jacobins. So you guys have been doing this stay-at-home series since the beginning of the pandemic, where usually you'll be hosting. Sometimes other people will have subbed for you a couple times. And there'll be some left-wing thinker who will come in there and give a presentation for about half an hour. And then you'll ask them some questions. But this time you did it yourself. So you weren't limited to the half an hour. And
I teased our book, the book that me, you, and Mike Beggs are working on, and people will hear a lot more about in the next year as we kind of get further along in the process. But a book laying out a vision of a feasible socialism, which should be out somewhere spring 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited about that. And I guess thinking about feasible socialism, the talk that you gave for the stay-at-home was about social democracy and how we should think about social democracy. And if you think, all right, so social democracy is, at least it's a word that's meant a lot of things, to different people at different times, but the way we usually use it now, right? We're talking about, movements, efforts, by leftists and socialists to reform capitalism by doing things like instituting social programs to provide for social rights like healthcare and housing, and of course that's what I was talking about with Harvey. But you mentioned the feasible socialism book, right? So this is a book that we're writing, you, me, and Mike Beggs, about how we could get beyond capitalism entirely, right? Without just sort of doing the thing that the left sometimes falls into doing, where we sort of treat socialism as this word that stands for some destination politically where we've achieved all the good things and gotten rid of all the bad things, but actually thinking about a realistic society that could actually exist without having to have society divided into workers and capitalists at all, right?
Right.
And so I think a reasonable question that somebody might have, right, listening to this is, well, hold on. So why are you guys so excited about social democracy if you think that it's possible to get past capitalism entirely, that we could have a society where workers own their own enterprises, and we didn't have this separate class of owners at all? Then hey, what's all this interest in messing with and rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic of capitalism, right? Why are we so interested in the social democratic reformism? And I know it's a big topic, but I was hoping you could just speak a little bit to how those two goals relate to each other, reforms within the existing system and trying to get past it entirely.
Well, I think for starters, it's worth saying that when we talk about social democracy, we're not just talking about stuff the government does or any system that has a lot of state intervention. Like we wouldn't call, for example, the French system under de Gaulle or the forms of planning that were utilized in Taiwan and South Korea and other countries that actually played a useful role stimulating growth, but certainly weren't egalitarian in their intent. We wouldn't call that social democracy. So
Right.
in particular, when we talk about the social democratic project, we're talking about projects that were led by workers' parties, parties with roots in the working class, that had initially at their core the impetus of class struggle in the early years. And then by the time the contradictions of social democracy, you could say, reached their peak in the 1970s, also had a rash of working class upsurge. So the bottom line is that it's the experience of working class governance and working class political movements, both in state power and also kind of the extra parliamentary parts like trade unions and trade confederations and affiliated social movements outside of power connected to them within the political economy of capitalism. So still obviously within the constraints of capitalism, but attempting to administer some change within it. So in the same way that as socialists, we should be interested in Chavez's Venezuela or what's happened in Bolivia and in other countries that have attempted to bring about, at the very least, reform programs from below with progressive social bases, we should be interested in these attempts as well in the global north. And if you can't win the class power to achieve something like Medicare for all in the United States, or achieve the rudiments of a social democratic program as far as a jobs guarantee and the rest, then how are you going to get the class power to put on the agenda demands for worker self-determination, worker ownership of the means of production in the workplace? So it seems to me that the two are absolutely integrally connected. So part of understanding the contradictions and limits of social democracy is thinking about how these reformist parties of social democracy had their limits, weren't great, not because they administered reforms, but because their political practice and their structures couldn't take them beyond those reforms. They would open the door to more radical questions, but they would not be able to answer them fully. So we should clarify what our criticism from the left is. It isn't against these important kind of building back blocks to, kind of building state, some sort of left workers' power. In the United States, obviously, we are so far from the limits of social democracy. We are so far from achieving anything. The left really needs to tally victories to tell people that, if you support left candidates, you aren't just registering a protest. It's connected to real material differences in your lives.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Just I guess to make the conversation less classy, I often think of the scene in Kill Bill where Uma Thurman is escaping from the hospital and she's still sort of paralyzed and she's just trying to get herself to wiggle her big toe, so she can eventually, start walking and get in the car and go off to slaughter her enemies. And I think there's something, there's something there, right? That like, that just achieving, Canadian style healthcare in the United States, which, it's absurd to talk about that as just in the sense that we're all living through this grisly real world advertisement for the importance of universal healthcare. But it's also like just achieving that is going to take monumental political struggle. We just saw the DNC platform committee vote down Medicare for all, like 125 to 36, which is amazing because it's a party platform. It's like a wish list for the party faithful that like almost nobody else actually reads. Be like the safest, most like symbolic way to concede the point, but they're not willing to do it even there, which shows you how much of an uphill climb we've got on there. But certainly, I think if we can start to achieve some things that really make a difference to people, and by the way, should also say that like certainly in the kind of socialism that we want, that we think is realistic and we could imagine happening in the near future, in our lifetimes, right? It's like peace in our time, socialism in our time. That we having worker ownership of firms would be fantastic. It would be amazing. It would be the first time we didn't have society divided between a ruling class and a subordinate class since the agricultural revolution. But it wouldn't mitigate the need for things like a national health service.
Right, exactly. So some of these decommodifications are things we are taking, the meaning of decommodification, right? We're taking it from the market. We're making sure that people can enjoy the social rights. But what would the health system look like in a place like the United Kingdom under full socialism, quote unquote? Well, it would probably look a lot like the NHS, right? Or at least the way the NHS used to be in its peak in the 70s, before they added additional user fees and things like that. So yeah, I think it's just very straightforward why we should care about these things. And also, I'm in general very comfortable with the fact that political leaders like AOC and Bernie and a host of people who support them call themselves democratic socialists. So their aspirations are, in many ways, social democratic, in that, at least when it comes to AOC, at no point in her life has she talked about really worker ownership, the means of production, and so on. Bernie, for large chunks of his life, openly advocated for some sort of socialization there. And I think if you probably catch him in private, he might not back down. He might say, okay, well, it can't be old school nationalization. Maybe it has to be this or that form. But he probably just thinks it's not feasible. I don't think he's really repented from any of his prior positions. But, the left is so weak in this country. Socialism, I think, has a bigger danger of falling back into the ghetto of just extreme sectarian self-isolation. And that's a bigger danger than having socialism be so extremely ill-defined that it means any avocation of decommodification. So I'd rather, in other words, have a broad movement that calls itself socialist, that fights day to day for social democratic reforms, and then to that movement make the argument that we need to go beyond social democracy. I think that's a great starting point for us to be on the left. But obviously, when we talk about socialism, we don't just mean what a lot of Berniecrats do when they say they're socialists and they support small business and they believe in a mix of, capitalism and socialism. That's why they're democratic socialism. I think that's a common sense of, several million Berniecrats in this country, and we have to work from that common sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Liza Featherstone, Jackman columnist, could be coming on in about 10 minutes. Maybe still does do this advice column for the Nation, where there was one that I loved from back in 2016, where the person who was writing in was like, "Hey, my friend, calls himself a socialist, but he listens to all these he watches all these lame commentators on MSNBC and he doesn't really understand what it means, and how do I break it to him, right, that he's not a real socialist?" And her answer was basically that socialism, I think these were her words, isn't like your favorite indie band that's not cool anymore because too many people like it, right? That we're not going to be able to achieve any of our political goals unless this breaks through to a much bigger category of people. And it was an advice column answer. It didn't go on for that long, but I think you could expand the point in ways you're just suggesting by saying, look, which is more productive, right? Standing off in a corner somewhere saying, "Hey, we're real socialists," right? Not like you pretenders, so don't you go, be calling yourself that, or saying, "Hey, welcome comrades, when we use this term, we mean some stuff that maybe goes beyond what you mean, but but we also see you as political allies, and we want to fight together for all the stuff that we do both agree on." And actually, even on the AOC point, by the way, I think that's mostly true, although there have been a couple of interesting instances in which she has gestured in the direction of something that actually does deal with questions about the workplace and ownership. Most notably, on Martin Luther King Day this year, she was doing a discussion with Ta-Nehisi Coates, where they started talking about Jeff Bezos's charitable giving. And she said, "Hey, I don't, we don't want Bezos's money, or presumably what she meant is we don't just want Bezos's money. Bezos's money would be a nice start. We want his power. If he really wants
Yes,
to be a good
exactly.
person,
Yes.
he should turn Amazon into a worker co-op, which, whatever you think about the limitations of AOC's politics or the ways that she's imperfect, that's not a sentence I would have expected to hear from a sitting congresswoman probably in my lifetime if you told me that a couple years earlier.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that we have a great starting point compared to where we were 5 years ago. But fundamentally, as socialists, we should acknowledge the division between socialism today as a largely intellectual current and a subcultural current in American political life. Before it wasn't even that, right? We were run out of academia, and we weren't even large enough to be a subculture. We were a subculture. We weren't like the Harry Potter fan club. We were like the people who like went out to play Quidditch on broomsticks or something. I don't know. But there's that division that's emerged between socialism as an intellectual current and social movements and the workers' movement as it exists, right? And our job as socialists is to get to the point where we can merge together, fuse together those currents so we could speak of them as one and the same. And when you think about the history of especially early European social democracy, the early social democratic parties, it was that combined workers' movement. When you think about what certain national liberation movements have become, it was a fusing together of all those elements. When you think about what MAS and these other parties, MAS in Bolivia and these other parties were, it's a fusing together of trade union and social movement and the political socialist currents together into a mass formation. And part of the problem today is that we need to both be confident in our mission, confident in what we're doing, but also aware of how weak we are. And it's a difficult thing to combine, but if you're not aware of how weak you are, then you might be able to pretend, oh, look around me, there's plenty of workers here. Half the people in my GTAA chapter are wage workers who have part-time jobs and feel all these sorts of other things. The depiction of GTAA as largely middle-class people is wrong, right? You could say things like that, and you might be right in the micro instances, but you're missing a wider truth, a wider point, which is that the left in the U.S. is isolated from a mass base, and we need to try to go out there and get one. And I'm less afraid of mistakes in the direction of a vulgarization of our ideas or mistakes in the direction of a mainstreaming of our ideas, as long as it doesn't mean, to use very old left language, very obscure left language, class collaboration. As long as it doesn't mean sitting down at the table with Jeff Bezos and figuring out some sort of corporate scheme to, do this, that, or what, then I'm very comfortable with what AOC is doing, what Bernie is doing, what a lot of other figures associated with DSA are doing. And we just have to keep pressing forward in this environment. We can't go back to even 2015, even the environment before Bernie, where you had the return of protests, but it wasn't crystallized around a clear and coherent demands that could win majoritarian support. And that's what we constantly have to search for when it comes to everything we're fighting for. Obviously not just things in the workplace and Medicare, but fights against oppression of all kinds. These just need to be tied to concrete material demands.
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to something I was talking about with Harvey, right? I mean, that kind of genius of that civil rights movement slogan about, jobs and freedom, March on Washington for jobs and freedom, that it ties together the particularity of demand for full civic and legal equality for everybody, right? Across all identity categories, with an economic agenda that is maybe going to disproportionately benefit the people who've been the greatest victims of the current system, but is also just going to benefit most people as a general rule, which just seems like, it's not a big like Marxist insight or anything, but does seem to be true that that if you can appeal to the perceived material interests of the majority of the population, you're a lot more likely to win. I do want to just pivot for a minute to since we kind of referred to it earlier, but I don't know if people really get a good sense from that of what winning might look like. Now, obviously, like we just said, even achieving, Canadian style Medicare for all in the United States, is going to be an epic struggle. The idea that, okay, maybe if we eventually push social democracy to its limits, we get a situation where you either have to retreat from what's already been achieved or you have to go beyond capitalism entirely. But of course, in the US context, if you're living in the real world, we are hilariously and tragically far from being at that crossroads, right? Like the limits of social democracy are nowhere in sight. But if we imagine a situation where they were, where like, for example, something you talk about in your talk, right, was the most advanced, Nordic social democracies at the point where there were starting to be schemes proposed to do things that would go beyond capitalism entirely. Hi, Liza. And then you think, okay, well, what would actually taking the route not taken look like, right? That like if you think about, all right, we know what retreat from what's already been achieved looks like, because sadly we've seen that all over the place, right? That's a very familiar story.
I think the route not taken would be a route that brings in questions of power and ownership sooner. In other words, what the Swedes and other forms of social democracy settle for is what they described as a functional socialism. So they achieved actually a huge measure an egalitarian distribution of wealth. But an egalitarian distribution of wealth isn't the same thing as an egalitarian distribution of power. There was a time in the 50s and 60s when that distinction seemed purely ideological. But what in fact happened was the inegalitarian distribution of power led to a rollback of the distribution of wealth. So if you want a sustainable social democracy, you have to push towards democratic socialism, because you have to push towards a condition where you don't have a class of people who have a vested interest in rolling back the rights of labor. And you don't have this contradiction, to use very old kind of Marxist language, between the class of owners and the class of laborers. And in many ways, giving workers power over production is a way of resolving that tension and that antagonism in society. Of course, there'll still be other politicized antagonisms. There'll still be maybe the tension between a region that's very wealthy and a region that needs to have some transfers of wealth to that region. There'll still be contradictions between town and country. There'll still be contradictions between worker owners in different sectors of various levels of profitability that are taxed at different rates and whatnot. But those are political problems that can be resolved in the framework of the state, of bargaining, of any sorts of other ways, but they're not as ingrained as the tensions that arose in these countries between a small group of capitalists that felt their profits being squeezed, a group of workers who felt like they deserved more rights from vis-a-vis kind of their bosses, but also from the society as a whole, public sector workers and private sector workers, all these tensions. So all this led to the unraveling of a lot of the social democratic arrangement. I think we have to be careful and not state that it's all been undone. A huge portion of the wealth of these countries are still going towards social ends. They're still funding pension and healthcare and education at a far greater extent than it is even in a place like the United States and other advanced capitalist countries that didn't have the experience of social democracy. But I think that's the key thing. Think about questions of power and ownership early rather than just as a culmination. So we don't want to rerun social democracy and just sit in power from 1930 to 1970 before we even begin to propose more radical distributions of power.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That we do want to learn from the mistakes of past social democratic movements, but we also do need to start with social democracy, right? You can't walk without crawling, and all the cliched metaphors there.
Yes, but it needs to be a form of social democracy rooted in class struggle, rooted in the same thing that gets you those more radical things. It can't be Gaullism or a form of kind of statist intervention, because I think in our lifetime we will see real Trumpism. So Trump himself wasn't a believer, let's say, in what Bannon believed in and what some parts of his coalition believed in. And we'd be in a much more scary place if we had a racist, xenophobic leadership that was actually willing to deficit finance and willing to give jobs and buy off segments of the working class that way. Luckily, Trump is really just a bastard in every sense. He has very little concern even for his some of his alleged constituents. So we dodged a bullet there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I just also say that, for anybody who until the spring of 2022 or, whenever the Feasible Socialism book comes out, wants to get a little bit of a sense of what some of the best developed ideas about what, the running part of the first you crawl, then you walk, then you run, might actually look like, and what a left agenda that actually did something about these questions of workplace autonomy, of power structurally within the economy looked like. Your book, your earlier book, The Socialist Manifesto, the first chapter is very good on that, and also as a longtime resident of New Jersey in the past, I really appreciate that the fictional class struggle social democratic movement in the first chapter of that book is called Bon Joviism. I enjoyed that.
But it's Springsteenism. That's a social democracy. Bon Jovi, it's false consciousness. I think everybody knows Springsteen is the true ruler of New Jersey. It's I guess which one's Turnpike and which one's Parkway. Anyway, that's for another discussion. I'm sure Liza actually probably has an opinion on that in particular, but I should let you two get to it, and maybe even having Liza on the screen reminds me that we should actually probably do a nice Jacobin YouTube panel at some point with us three and maybe another good interlocutor.
Oh, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming on, brother. Really appreciate it.
Take care. Yeah, appreciate it. Best
Good
of luck.
to see you, Vasco.
All right, bye.
How are you doing today, Liza?
Very well. How are you, Ben?
I'm good. This has been really good. And yeah, I was excited. By the way, there was a question somebody asked about using capitalist decline to take ownership of mass media. I'd say, Bhaskar just referred to the Jacobin YouTube channel. It's a mundane answer, but it's a I think building that up, right? These efforts at more left media in more places, is a pretty good start. And I recently read something you wrote for Jacobin about these recent socialist victories in New York state assembly elections, or I guess primaries, but primaries in places where the primary is the election.
Yeah, in our case, they basically won.
Right. And I mean, one thing is, like, it's just nice to read. I mean, first of all, right, it's just nice right now to read about any kind of victory, because the last year, has been pretty grim in a lot of ways. After the defeat of the Labour Party last year in the UK, it's a point where Jeremy Corbyn's Lieutenant John McDonnell said, look on the bright side. Usually when socialist revolutions are defeated, everybody's taken to a soccer stadium and shot. And that feeling that if there's a bright side, it's something like that, right?
Exactly. At least we're not in the soccer stadium getting
Exactly. And I've definitely been feeling that a lot in the months between the Nevada caucus and now. But reading your article made me feel good. So and it was also just like a really nice just a nice piece of writing, like taking like this like nice little history lesson and doing all those things that the writing instructors say about showing, not telling, to kind of like say something about how we might learn from that, right? While just being understated and nicely done. But I guess like just first of all, so who are these people who just won these state assembly primary elections?
Yeah. So, well, I'll say as well as being a Jacobin columnist, I'm also a DSA member. So I'm just unabashedly, biased towards the greatness of these people. So I just, not to make people feel that we are sneaking anything on them. They're a really great group of people. We re-elected Julia Salazar. She was already in the state senate. She was our first DSA person to get in there, and she really, in a very short time, did great work. Although we have a really vigorous tenants' rights movement here, I really do not think we would have gotten the phenomenal package of reforms expanding tenants' rights, which hadn't been done in decades. I mean, really. That movement is just always on the defensive, just always like keeping something bad from happening,
right,
rather than actually able to push forward. And really with Julia and as well as some progressives in the state senate, they were and the movement was really invigorated, and it was a dual process, the streets and the legislators. So Julia had a lot of successes to point to, and was is extremely popular in her district, and was reelected easily.
Which I should say is fantastic, because if anybody remembers when she was first elected, that did not seem like a sure thing, to put it like.
Yeah, well, that was a fascinating situation, because sometimes we media people think that what's happening in the media is so important, so there were all these scandalous stories about her in the media, and and of course then those are broadly shared on social media, which just kind of becomes just another,
so it seems like, oh, she's really in trouble,
the media, right? And so then everybody who's extremely online is like, oh no, this is terrible, and like and my friends are all my media friends are all like texting me being like, what's going on, should we still support her, and like what's our, and I'm just like, no, we're still supporting her. We don't care about any of this. We're maintaining party discipline here. And when you would go out and knock on doors, because I volunteered on that campaign, and when you would go out and knock on doors, like not a single person would say, I read this scandalous thing.
Right.
Like you would go and you would say, this person is running to represent you, and she's really concerned about affordable housing and stuff like this. And then you would go around Bushwick into the various housing projects and talk about that, and people were like, that sounds great.
Yeah. And, so they actually cared more about housing than about like all of these details and scandals and pseudo scandals about her personal life and her background. Right. All that seemed like a little bit less important than having affordable
and
housing.
Her Jewish identity and like long stories that were like planted in the or she did something strange when she was in college, or astonishingly, not a single working class person in her district
actually
was
cared about any of that.
Any of this.
It's like, okay, that's nice about housing, but like I want to hear about like her Jewish bona fides, right? Like a little mother, father, what do you know? Like,
right, exactly. Or like was she born in Colombia? Was she born here? Like, no, not these were not pressing issues to people who weren't on the Twitter all day. So that was so it was sort of a fascinating case study, and the fact is, the most authentic thing about Julia is her socialist politics. So we really got lucky with that.
Yeah, which is the part that actually matters, right?
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, she was reelected easily, and actually, to me, we pay a lot more attention. Again, being part of the media, we and Jacobin are part of this too. We pay a lot more attention to the newer people, and we should, because they're wonderful. But I personally, it actually was even more exciting to me that Julia and as well as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were reelected, because to me that shows that socialists can can build power and serve the people when we get into office, as well as just successfully campaign, which is only one thing.
Right.
That we can actually stay there and be really successful. It seems even better than that we can get elected. So also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mirrored that absolutely overwhelming victory and popularity in her own district, but that's a separate story because we're talking about
and where I'm from in mid-Michigan, Rashida Tlaib absolutely dominated that primary, which was a very similar thing, because there were like very online people who were convinced that like people would care that she'd like booed Hillary Clinton last year. And it's like yeah, no, weirdly enough, nobody in like John Conyers' old district of Detroit actually gave a shit about that like at all.
Exactly.
Anybody who noticed probably liked her more because of it, but
right.
But yeah,
exactly. So we've got, so the other people were amazing. So we had also so Farah Sufrant Forrest who is now my assemblywoman representing me in my district, and she is a nurse and a tenant activist, and and just like a really really wonderful woman, and also my state senator now, Jabari Brisport, is a middle school teacher, and a longtime DSA member. I mean, he was one of our first campaigns that like a couple years ago we tried to run him for city council, and he ran on the Green Party, which is like not not as successful a strategy I mean, this is a neighborhood where a lot of people will just vote for whoever is the Democrat, and it's just not it's not culturally a logical fit to run on the Green Party. But we learn things, and then Marcella Mitaines is now, actually, this is sort of gratifying to me when I think about how we're really how we're kind of broadening our appeal. Marcella is in her late 30s, and she has a 20-year-old daughter, and I mean, so where people are not all like really young. Like, so that's also really nice.
That is good.
Yeah, it is. I think that's, I mean, I think it's good for us to be a vibrant youth movement, and I'm not just saying this because I myself am a middle-aged mom, but I just think that the world is composed of a lot of different working people with different at different points in the age, in the life cycle, and I think it's really good to have people who have had a lot of different experiences representing our movement, and also Marcella was born in Peru. I mean, it's quite a journey to the New York State Assembly, and then we have I think so this is a very interesting guy too. We have Zoran Kwame Mamdani, who won an assembly seat in Queens, in Astoria, and he is a really really fascinating person. He's a by his day job, he counsels people on getting out of foreclosure. So he had a really intimate and nuanced sense of what the constituents were dealing with in terms of direct confrontation with capital over their housing every day. And you know, he's his family spent time in refugee camps. I mean, he had the whole he has this also fascinating immigrant story. Yeah, and so these people are all so different from each other, but they each represent New York's immigrant communities and working class in a really different and interesting way, and they are such comrades. I mean, the races were really not just races of individuals for which, you know, DSA was sort of a common organization. These races were really very intertwined with the candidates, communicating to each other a lot, the campaigns coordinating, and it was really seen as one big New York City DSA effort, and you know, it was so depressing when the pandemic hit, and you know, we had to go inside and we couldn't knock on doors, I wrote this piece in February about following Zoran around and knocking on doors with him, and it was like within the piece went up a little late, and the pandemic was just hitting, and already it felt like this sad nostalgia piece about how we used to be, you know, and it was like, you know, it was like, and then we knocked on the door, and this, you know, this guy comes to the door, and we're like excited to like hear what he's gonna say, and you know, it was just like, oh, this is like, none of this can happen anymore. It's so sad, you know, so it was so like, it was so demoralizing when that happened, and the way that people built up an entirely different way of communicating with the community, and just, you know, and was really able to make phone banking work and to make it feel like a collective thing. I mean, like, you know, even, and it's such a you know, on most campaigns, phone banking is this thing you just really don't want to do. It's so alienating, and like, you know, and just like really like it's really boring and terrible labor.
Certainly
right?
had those experiences, but
but it really, the DSA campaigns really invigorated it and found so many ways to communicate with people and get it and get the message out. And you know, it's not, I think that it's what's much more the case is that the victory was a result of the very hard work of organizing that so many people did, and the ability that this organization now has to reach so many volunteers and get them roped in, and I tend to not think that we win so much by having the perfect message as by all of that hard work. However, our message was really good. I mean, like we just really talked all the time about the things that matter to people most and that are most central to everyone's well-being. I mean, and housing was an absolute unifying theme across all of the campaigns. And you know, they talked a great deal about the other very material issues affecting people in the district, like healthcare and education as well. You know, and
which is, you know, which definitely does bring us to you know, the history lesson part of your article, which I want to just touch on for a minute, because this is so cool. That this crop of socialists going to the state assembly is certainly more, diverse in the backgrounds they come from, not all male, etc. But this is not the first time there have been several people from a socialist organization in the New York State Assembly. Can you talk about that for a minute?
So this is just one of those things that you just love learning. So our little victory of electing 5 socialists from one organization to the New York State government in 2020 was a lovely way to celebrate the centennial of a little known piece of earlier socialist history. So in 1919, 5 socialists from the Socialist Party, Eugene V. Debs's party, which I think later became Socialist Party of America, but yeah, I think at this point it's just Socialist Party, and they were they were like, some of them were already in the assembly, and some of them were elected for the first time. Much like our candidates, you're absolutely right. They were not as diverse as the slate that we just elected. They were all white. None of them were African American. And they were also all men, but similarly, some of them did come from immigrant communities at that time, and some and were working class people, and they had a very similar agenda to our current socialists in that I just love this way that that 2 of them wrote about it. They described their socialist principles this way: to make the lives of the people happier. Their daily question was this: is this for the benefit of the workers? If it is, we're for it. If it is not, we're against it. And I just thought that's something that's unchanged. I mean, socialists are just really doing the same things that we've always been doing. So it is quite a story. They were elected in 1919, and by the way, at that point, assembly terms were only 1 year, which for those of us who have volunteered even a little bit on these recent campaigns,
it's kind of daunting thinking about having to do that again every year.
Poor people had to do it again every year, and I'm sure that it took just as much work then as it does now, and so that's something to be thankful for. But yeah, so the assembly campaigns were only a year, and they were elected, and then the country was in the grip of the Red Scare, which was a total panic caused by a total panic in the American ruling class, prompted by the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and the U.S. ruling class was absolutely convinced that something like that was just around the corner here, and that, I mean, not completely without basis, because there was a lot of radical organizing going on here, and there was a lot of and there, and in fact, that Red Scare had a very anti-immigrant component, which was not simplistically just racist. I mean, the ruling class correctly noticed that a lot of people coming from other countries had more radical and more leftist views, and were fairly good organizers, good at convincing the native-born working class that socialism had some merits, and so there was a so just following the Palmer raids, in which Woodrow Wilson's government targeted and tried to deport successfully in some cases a number of leftist immigrants, the Republicans and Democrats in the New York State Assembly voted to expel our 5 socialists in 1919. And they had them forcibly removed by armed police when they refused to leave the capital. In a account I read about this at the time, reportedly, a few Democrats were a little embarrassed about having done this, and as the socialists were dragged out, they muttered, "Sorry, boys, we couldn't help it." Which I just think is
that's just a
so
perfect.
Democrats are going to be
That's
right?
that's peak Democrat. That
It's
like we're not
Democrat,
not going to stop you.
Drag you out.
From...
They're like, "Oh, we're so sorry."
And there's so after they were kicked out, right? So I know, you said in the article, there's a trial. I think you said some account said only the lobbyists were sober.
Yes,
which is amazing.
The trial just totally after the verdict, and it was upheld that the socialists should be kicked out, and then just like everyone is drinking, and one of their colleagues says they should be strung up to the nearest lamppost with their feet dangling in the air, but they there was a special election held to fill the seats, since those districts were now unrepresented, and all 5 of the socialists were reelected.
So which is great too, because that means we're at the exact 100 years from that happening this fall.
So our victory is a lovely way to celebrate the centennial of that. It was a short-lived victory because they were expelled again. 3 of them were expelled again, and the other 2 resigned in solidarity. But a number of them ran later and were reelected. So like they just they nevertheless persisted. So as we have done, and now
which
as we've done now 100 years later.
Impressive instance, maybe, of persistent.
Yeah,
than that one, but
reclaim it.
I like it. So yeah. Oh, and by the way, I should ask, somebody in the Q&A was wanted to hear your reaction to the Cori Bush victory in Missouri, going along with what we've been talking about.
Oh, so exciting! I mean, just such a wonderful victory. Yeah, and I heard that I have heard from people active in police issues and those movements and socialists, that she is a real comrade. I mean, this is this is one of those things, one of those developments that is as good as it looks, which is really nice in politics.
No, absolutely, especially circling back.
Sometimes you think, oh, maybe if I knew more about this, I'd be really disappointed. But it turns out actually,
this particular case,
this really is good news.
Yeah, that's excellent. I just wanted to close out with at the end of your article, you quote Morris Hillquit, who was one of the main leaders of the Socialist Party in 1920, as well as serving as a defense lawyer for the Socialist Assemblymen when they were being purged.
Yeah.
And this is just such a perfect way to cap it off. I love this so much. Henceforth, it will be a finish fight between social democracy and capitalist absolutism. The fight is only beginning. The socialists are ready for it.
It seems very timely. Yeah.
Yeah, it really does. So yeah, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Ben. What a delight. And congratulations on the new show.
Thank you so much. Somebody in the chat or the Q&A said they couldn't find Jacobin anywhere. I'm not sure if they're talking about the magazine or the YouTube. I think the YouTube channel, I think if you just search Jacobin into YouTube, you should find that. The magazine is jacobinmag.com. So JACOBINMAG.com. Somebody also asked if this was going to be clipped in segments on YouTube alongside the whole podcast. And it is actually very lucky, very happy about this, that we've got Forrest on board, who's the video editor from the Michael Brooks Show, who is also going to be the video editor for this show. He's going to be doing the same kinds of things, putting out clips and segments, and so I'm really excited about that. The kind of professionalism that he's bringing to this. Along with David Feldman, Cole James Cash, J. Andrew World, who made that awesome logo for the podcast. So again, much like capitalist business enterprises, there are a lot of people you're not seeing on screen who contribute to making the product, and it's worth emphasizing. I also got a question in the chat. People who are going to be listening to this later as a podcast are not going to see this, but behind me, one of the books marring my bookshelf is Glenn Beck's Arguing with Socialists, which I actually got a little while back because I said, the joke was that if I got up to 100 people on my Patreon, I should do something along the lines of some gimmicky thing, like say I'm going to eat a bowl of spiders or something. So Glenn Beck's book about socialism is certainly a bowl of literary spiders. And since, did make it up to 100, I did read it. It's about as bad as you'd think it would be. But I co-wrote a review of it with Nathan Robinson for Current Affairs. A few episodes down the line, Nathan's going to be joining us to talk about that review. It's called Educating Glenn Beck. And I should also say that episode 2 next Saturday, that's the 15th, is going to have David Griscom, who does the economics segments on the Michael Brooks Show. But he's going to come on, and this is not a joke. I really want to talk to him about whiskey and country music, as well as, of course, about socialist politics. And then, because I don't want this all to be me just talking to people I agree with, Dave Smith, who's a libertarian podcaster and comedian who I've debated in the past, is going to come on and talk to him a little bit about comedy, but also about our political disagreements. And then Lee Phillips, who's the co-author of a really wonderful book I strongly recommend about economic planning. I think probably the smartest thing that I've read, certainly, about the prospects for socialist economic planning, the People's Republic of Walmart. Lee Phillips is actually coming right after the libertarian discussion with Dave. And then the last guest, certainly not least, to put it mildly, for episode 2 is going to be the great Anna Kasparian. And so I'm really looking forward to that episode. If you're watching this later on YouTube, or you're listening to it as a podcast, you should know that these are recorded live to tape with a Zoom studio audience. So if you go over to my Twitter or my Patreon, so it's twitter.com/Ben Burgis, BenBurgis, or patreon.com/Ben Burgis. The way this is going to work is, as soon as this is recorded, the raw Zoom video recording is going to go up on the Patreon for patrons. Then by Monday, thanks to the hard work of David Feldman and Forrest from Tnbs, it's going to be up. The whole thing is going to be up on YouTube and as a podcast, and then there should be YouTube clips throughout the week. So I'm really happy about this. I'm thrilled about the support and the people who came to sit in on the taping on Zoom, and I'm really excited about this project. So thank you all, and I will see you next Saturday.